Welcome once again to the Sirius Report. This is Paul from the Sirius Report, and today the subject we're going to discuss relates to China and how Western nations are sometimes covertly or less covertly turning up in Beijing with a begging bowl. Now, it's worth recalling this matter with respect to the United States and China, because on several occasions during the Biden administration, we saw US officials, including Yellen, going with a begging bowl to Beijing, basically saying, please, please buy our US treasuries. And of course, China was not interested in doing so in any way, shape or form. This happened on at least 2 or 3 occasions. There were other US officials who would turn up under the same guise, but then of course statements came out, or we reminded China of its obligations to human rights, just the usual statements that actually mean nothing and have no basis in reality. Of course, this all comes on the back of the fact that the United States has had a pretty checkered relationship with China for a number of years, particularly during the Trump administration, where we saw all this idea of putting sanctions on Huawei, which failed to materialize. Didn't destroy Huawei. It knocked them initially, but they've come back very strongly. Also, of course, the United States, this has been an ongoing issue through the Biden administration, is trying to cripple China by putting sanctions and measures in place so they couldn't get hold of semiconductor chip technology. China got round that, and they're also now producing even 5 nanometer technology, albeit not mass production, but they have made giant strides in a very short space of time. And this is one of these situations where the US came out all guns blazing, thinking they'd get China back on track the way they want the relationship with China to be, and of course it failed totally. Rather like the tariff wars that Trump put in place, they actually backfired, and it had a very sort of bad outcome for the United States. Didn't particularly affect China. If you look at Chinese exports to the United States, and in the last 7-8 years, it's had no impact. It certainly impacted US exports to China. And then, of course, we're starting to, and we've talked about this previously, rumblings that Trump wanted to form a G2 with China, which basically meant we're going to be the 2 global superpowers and we'll carve up the world and do things the way we'd like to do. And of course, as we said previously, China has no interest whatsoever in doing that, because China does not want to be an hegemonic power. They realized what a failure it is to do so, because at the end of the day, what are you going to get in return for spending trillions and trillions of dollars on failed wars, regime change and other operations throughout the world, and absolutely nothing to show for it? They'd rather spend trillions on rebuilding their country, putting infrastructure in place and assisting businesses and growing the productive parts of the economy, which ultimately is the lifeblood of a nation. So in essence, China and the United States have been going through this process for quite some period of time. It remains to be seen what subsequently happens with the Trump administration in the next 4 years or so. But I'm mentioning this because there's a very interesting development we've seen between China and the United Kingdom. Now, for quite a long time, China has invested very heavily in the United Kingdom, in infrastructure projects, in ports, etc., very quietly, but there's been substantial amounts of money that are put in place. And if you recall, when you go back to the Cameron government, came into office in 2010 in the UK, they talked about this golden age with China, and there seemed to be a lot of promise that started to fizzle out. And okay, partially this may be to do with the COVID years, but essentially the United Kingdom never had any major trip there since 2017. And I'm not saying it happened all of a sudden, but then there is now recently an announcement where, and they have gone, a UK contingent, and we'll come on to who the people who've gone and why this is significant. Now, we know the United Kingdom at first embraced Huawei, and it continued to embrace Huawei, and then all of a sudden the United States must have said enough's enough, because then the United Kingdom decided to change its attitude towards Huawei, and then came out with this statement that all Huawei equipment would have to be moved out of UK networks, etc. by 2027. I thought, okay, why is it 2027? Because it takes a long time to swap hardware and equipment out of networks. It's not this plug and play where you just take something out, plug something else in. And already from a UK perspective, this has proved to be costly. It's also proved to be quite arduous, and it's led to network issues and also complaints of a degradation in network performance. I've heard a lot of statements coming out from people I know in the UK who have businesses, etc. This has been a problem, and they've been swapped out of Huawei hardware, and they're not very happy about it. But anyway, so the UK has had this checkered relationship in that regard with China. But it's worth noting, when there was this big emphasis in the United Kingdom and Europe, which was obviously something the United States wanted to see, is, well, China's far too competitive and cost effective in electric vehicles market, so you must put tariffs on Chinese EVs. And of course, interestingly, the United Kingdom stated we're not going to do this. So in some ways, the UK has not been playing ball entirely with the United States and China. So who's gone on this trip, and why is it significant? Because ordinarily, often in these cases, you will see a lot of business executives, etc., going on this trip. Now, I'm not saying they aren't there, but it would appear the following people have gone, which is representative of the UK government, which is the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Tellingly and also interestingly, there is the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey. There is the Financial Conduct Authority Chief Nikhil Rathi, and there are senior executives present from UK banks. One, I think logically at the very least, that will be HSBC and Standard Chartered, who obviously have a presence in Hong Kong, etc. Now, it would seem logically that the initial aim of this visit relates to the financial component of the relationship with China. I think at some point, of course, that's going to then have to become related to business and trade, commerce, etc. Now, why, of course, would the United Kingdom want to go to China? Because it's absolutely crystal clear UK gilt markets are in serious trouble. They're imploding. We had this problem going back in the autumn of 2022 and all the fiasco with the then UK Prime Minister Truss and this mini budget, and someone got very angry about it. And all of a sudden, the gilt market started playing up, and it caused serious problems for pension funds, as an obvious case. And the Bank of England had to step in to try and keep the markets in an orderly fashion, and one could legitimately argue on the back of that, Truss went, and that was, the end of her being the Prime Minister. Now, the argument would be is the UK gilt markets are in as big a mess, I think, as they were in the autumn of 2022. So why is the Bank of England not seeking to bail out institutions again because of this problem with soaring yields in the gilt markets? Well, it might be, at least in part, one of the reasons, certainly why the Bank of England Governor Bailey has gone to Beijing. What we can say, because of the current problems in gilt markets, this is going to impact insurance companies, pension funds, for the same reasons it did previously, where in principle they are sitting seriously underwater, not with realised losses, but unrealised losses, which have yet to be crystallised. But the argument could be they may suddenly end up being crystallised. then these institutions are in big trouble, and there's no doubt this will also be impacting banks. Now, to what extent it's affecting all these institutions, we can't say with any clarity, but I think the initial aim of sending the UK Chancellor, the Bank of England Governor, the FCA Chief, and some senior execs from UK banks is precisely to go, we've got a serious problem in the financial sector. China, what can you do to help us? Now, of course, what China can do is say, okay, you clearly as a country have serious financial problems, your economy's cratering, and everybody knows the UK is suffering enormously. This is not a secret. So the argument could be, and I'm not suggesting this will happen, but it's quite legitimate to think that perhaps the UK would go along and say, well, China, can you buy a load of UK gilts in enormous quantities? And what this might do is help stabilise the gilt markets. I mean, it doesn't necessarily say it or suggest it will do, but it could do. And Britain needs to sell a load of debt anyway, whether governments like it or not. There's no doubt that they're not in a position to do anything other than that. So China might be a possibility to, wouldn't necessarily always characterise it bailing out the UK, but maybe in some senses you could suggest that is the case. And, therefore the question is, okay, if China is to do that, to try and stabilise financial markets in the UK, stabilise insurance companies, pension funds, banks, then what does China want in return? That's the question, because China's not going to just go, okay, yeah, we'll buy a bunch of debt. I mean, yes, in 2008, that's exactly what China did. It's not a well-known fact that China bailed out the West and stopped it collapsing in 2008-9. Is China prepared to do that again? Well, I doubt it. They've not shown any evidence to do that with the US, but they must have had sufficient interest and also a desire to cooperate with the Chinese and not antagonize China. I mean, the risk always is officials go over there, they have a private conversation, which is, please China, help us out, and then they publicly go outside and start going, we acted tough with China because this is for the British people and the British press, to make out that the UK and the US governments are tough on countries who aren't democracies like China, communist countries like China, which it isn't. And, we told them about their human rights records. We told them we're unhappy about Xinjiang and Hong Kong, etc., etc. And of course, the question is that going to happen this time? Because if it does, China's going to get very angry and probably pull the plug on anything that may have been agreed or tentatively agreed pending further discussions. But I think from China's perspective, what do they want in return? Well, they're going to want the proverbial pound of flesh. I think that's irrefutable, and that could well be cherry-picking assets in the United Kingdom which are failing and say, well, we'd like to take those assets. It might involve investment, which could be to build infrastructure, to put Chinese businesses in the UK. That might mean, of course, putting electric vehicle companies inside the UK, which won't be subject to tariffs. Therefore, they're very cost effective, and it makes the market very good for the Chinese. It doesn't help British car makers, but frankly, what British car makers exist anymore anyway? Yes, it might push certain other companies out the door, potentially, but, the old adage, beggars can't be choosers, applies to the United Kingdom now, because they are in serious trouble. So there are various ways that China can equally benefit from this relationship on that basis. Now, we're making some assumptions here. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume this is initially related to the financial sector rather than the business community. But the question is, even if they come to some agreement and everyone behaves themselves when they come out of meetings in Beijing, and even when, of course, they get back to the UK, what's the United States going to see this as? Because If Trump seriously wants to form some sort of G2 with China because he knows he can't beat them and defeat them economically or financially, he's certainly not going to go to war with China because China's a nuclear power, rather like Russia's a nuclear power. Maybe, and it's a big maybe and a big if, the United States realizes trying to provoke China into a war with Taiwan's futile and it's not going to happen. Frankly, if China wants to make Taiwan an issue, all it needs to do is blockade the island. And then, quite simply, Taiwan will fold within a few days because it will have no choice to do so. So it might be therefore seen by the United States that the UK is trying to undermine their relationship with China because that's how the US thinks. Anyone who does anything that benefits the in this case the UK and their relationship with China that might in some way impact the US, therefore the US sees the United Kingdom as a problem. I think this might be in part why there is a lot of hostility in the United States with regards to Starmer and the Labour government. Now, I'm no fan of any political party in the United Kingdom, certainly no fan of Starmer, but I think the relationship with China is upsetting certain people in the US, and this is why there's all these calls to try and get rid of the Starmer government and a desire to somehow get Reform Party into government, which is just not going to happen in reality. But having said that, the United Kingdom is falling flat on its face. Its economy is shot to bits. Its financial system is in serious trouble. Societally, it's in big trouble. And it needs an injection of reality into its existence. It needs to understand that multipolarity is here to stay and unipolarity is a thing of the past. It needs to build relationships with the Chinese. That's the starting point. So if it goes with a begging bowl to China, then so be it, with the usual caveats from a Chinese perspective. But this is the first step. It also, at some point, it will really stick in the throat of many people in the UK, and we're some way off this ever happening. That at some point they're going to have to make up with the Russians, which of course they just won't want to do, because in some ways the relationship with the most hardline anti-Russian or Russophobic people in the UK is far worse than their counterpart in the United States. But what this indicates once again is the world is changing enormously. The US and the UK realise that trying to defeat China is futile, but they could never, of course, say this publicly. But they will turn up in Beijing and privately, without saying it directly, but will admit it indirectly, that's the case. And frankly, it's about time both countries and Europe actually grew a backbone and said to the United States, we want to have a solid relationship with China. It's absolutely essential and critical to our future development. The same applies to the UK, and if they could have a golden age vision 2010 to about the period of 2014-15, then why can't they go back to that? Of course they can. And it's desperately something the United Kingdom needs. And it remains to be seen if there is any agreement on that basis with the Chinese or what the Chinese are prepared to do. But the UK gilt markets are on a knife edge, and the risk of a Bank of England intervention again is very much on the cards. So the timing, I think, is critical from the UK's perspective, and we await with keen interest what the outcome of this trip is. And hopefully the adults in the room can behave themselves and come out of this meeting and not feel they have to at all give the impression they were acting tough with China, because those days are long over. And frankly, it's just absolutely idiotic for Western nations to try and do this to China anymore, because they desperately need China to assist them as Western countries continue to sink into the proverbial abyss. And with that, we end this podcast. Thank you very much for all those who support us and subscribe to us. Please like, share, and subscribe. Spread the word, and we will continue to do what we always do, which is to inform people and not entertain them. And with that, I'll say goodbye.